Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when love was forbidden. Letters were dangerously scented, and monks had more drama than a reality show reunion. You find yourself trudging up a steep, muddy path somewhere in the misty countryside of 14th century France. It's late autumn. The trees are skeletal, the sky the color of wet linen, and there's a cold breeze slicing through your robe well. Not your robe exactly, but the one you're borrowing for tonight. Ahead of you looms the Abbey of Saint-Giraud, a squat, grim-faced complex of grey stone where the wind whistles through every crevice and the bells never quite ring on time. Inside, the air smells like melted beeswax, damp wool, and a hint of boiled cabbage. You probably won't survive this knot because it's dangerous exactly, but because the sheer boredom might flatten you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and local time in the comment sleds. See who else is falling asleep to doomed monastic romance. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you step past the main doors, which groan like they haven't been oiled since Charlemagne, and into the nave. It's just past matins. The monks are filing out, some yawning discreetly, others muttering prayers they definitely didn't finish. There's an odd tension in the air. You notice it in the way Brother Henry keeps glancing at the cloister wall, or how the cook hums too loudly while ladling yesterday's broth into today's pot. But most of all, you notice the way they avoid looking at Etienne. Etienne isn't like the others. While the rest scribble Latin with the emotional range of a dried plum, Etienne's pages curl with flowery asides and subtle curves. You wouldn't call him rebellious exactly, more ... distracted. He's barely 20, still new to the order, and already being eyed for library duty, which is monk speak for keep him away from the wine cellar and the choir girls. He walks differently, too, like someone who's imagining music that doesn't exist. His hands are stained with ink, and the sleeves of his robe are always just a little too long. The abbey isn't grand by any means. It's not one of those Gothic cathedrals where saints practically fall out of the rafters. Saint-Giraud is humble, drafty, and built more for penance than beauty, but its location is strategic, perched on a trade road used by merchants carting everything from goat cheese to bad poetry. And it's there, one evening as Etienne tends the garden herbs, that a little scroll drops through the fence tied with a string, smelling faintly of peaches. He doesn't open it right away. He's a monk. He's also curious and 19, which turns out to be a terrible combination for celibacy. The note is brief, written in a soft hand. You left your glove. Or was it mine? That's it. No name, no signature, just the oddest sensation of being watched. He tucks it under his robe and continues trimming the basil like nothing happened. But now he's humming something. And it's definitely not Gregorian chant. Historians still argue whether the abbey was already unstable before this scandal, or whether Etienne simply accelerated its descent. What's known for certain is that from that note onward, things start to shift. The food gets saltier. The prayers get longer. The scriptorium starts getting unusually crowded, particularly around Etienne's desk, because the second letter is even stranger. It references his last sermoner, truly forgettable piece on St. Giles, and modesty, and ends with, "I liked the part where you stumbled on the word blessed. I did too." Now, at this point, you might be wondering, is this a prank? A test from the abbot? A mistake? But Etienne doesn't care. His cheeks are flushed. His calligraphy, once steady, now loops and dances. He's falling and fast. And this is where you learn something crucial. Monasteries are not, as often imagined, peaceful vaults of contemplation. They are pressure cookers of suppressed emotion, gossip, and very bad stew. Give a group of men matching outfits, zero privacy, and a library of suppressed classics. And eventually, someone's going to crack. Etienne's third letter comes with a pressed violet inside. By this time, his bunkmate, Brother Louis, is pretending not to notice that Etienne spends every second free moment near the orchard gate. The orchard itself is forbidden after sundown. Something about temptation, or wolves, or maybe just monks, stealing apples. But that's where she appears. Not a figment, not a ghost. A girl in a brown cloak, with a face you wouldn't remember except for the way her mouth curves when she smirks. She never gives a name, she never stays long, but she returns. Again and again. Etienne brings her breadcrumbs and poetry. She gives him letters, riddles, and once a stolen lace cuff. They talk in metaphors, because talking plainly would make it real. She calls him Brother Daffodil, which he pretends to hate. He calls her Lady Rhubarb, because it makes her laugh through her nose. And for a while, it feels like a game. One no one notices, one no one minds, except someone does. There's always someone. It starts with missing parchment, then an inkpot vanishes. Someone scratches a heart into the lectern near Etienne's usual seat. Brother Henry starts coughing pointedly every time Etienne enters the chapel. And then there's Father Bernard. Father Bernard is the kind of monk who probably smells sin the way bloodhounds smell fear. He doesn't shout, he just lingers. His sermons shift from general calls for humility to oddly specific parables about disobedience, fleshly desire, and the dangers of foreign perfumes. At one point, he uses the phrase, peach-stained fingers, and Etienne nearly faints. But he doesn't stop, because what's the alternative? He's in too deep. The letters now live under his mattress, tucked between prayer scrolls and a crumpled drawing of two doves in a wineglass. The girl Lady Rhubarb has started talking about leaving her town, about taking a cart to the coast, about smuggling. Etienne, aboard dressed as a cheese merchant's assistant. He started believing it could happen. And here's the thing, it nearly does. It begins with a plan both ridiculous and alarmingly plausible. Etienne, who has never once successfully opened the Abbey's main gate without dropping his keys, is now plotting an escape worthy of an aging troubadour. He sketches it out under the guise of copying a page from St. Augustine, but instead of divine wisdom, the margins are littered with horse sketches and arrows pointing to old stable wall equals weak spot. His accomplice, the cloaked girl who still hasn't given her real name, though she occasionally answers to Beatrice, Nicolette, or, on one memorable note, the one who will burn this abbey down with kisses, suggests they leave during the Sunday feast, when half the monks are too busy reciting psalms with their mouths full to notice. Her family is due to visit a cousin in Bourges. Her father, a merchant of spices and well-aged hams, has a cart leaving just before dusk. All Etienne has to do is fake a stomach ailment, sneak out through the herb cellar, scale a modest fence, and hope no one recognizes him wearing borrowed shoes and a lady's scarf. What could possibly go wrong? Meanwhile, back inside the abbey, the whispers are evolving into full-blown murmurs. Monastic gossip, as it turns out, operates with the precision of a stock market. Brother Louis is caught muttering something about ink and sin in the laundry chamber. Brother Henry, who has quietly rebranded himself as Etienne, accidental nemesis, has begun library shelves in a way that mysteriously blocks all romantic poetry. Even the cook's cat, long known for sleeping and eating lap during vespers, now avoids him like he smells of shame and betrayal. The letters, hidden behind the third brick from the left in the novice dormitory, are multiplying. Some are brief, just a sentence, a question, a joke about the abbots snoring. Others stretch 4 pages, filled with soft longing and terrible medieval puns. One concludes, "Your voice is more comforting than warm goat's milk, even when you mispronounce Latin." Etienne nearly cries reading that one, which would have been fine if he hadn't been reading it in the middle of choir practice. Historians still debate whether the girl, who may or may not have been named Isabel, actually loved Etienne or simply enjoyed watching a monastic institution wobble under the weight of her affection. Some argue she was already betrothed to a viscount's nephew. Others believe she was the illegitimate daughter of a minor noble and a traveling musician, and thus drawn to drama like a candle to a curtain. The point is, she knew what she was doing. When she met Etienne in the orchard under a gnarled apple tree whose trunk still bore the scars of someone's long abandoned chessboard carving, she handed him a letter folded not once, but 12 times. He unfolded it slowly, breath held, while she looked up at him with the sort of expression you'd use to announce a surprise war or a wedding. The letter read, "Meet me Sunday. With a scarf, I'll bring Giram." Giram, as it turns out, is not a romantic rival. He is, in fact, a horse. Or more accurately, a deeply unmotivated, semi-retired cart horse with a tragic limp and the general demeanor of someone who once lost a staring contest with a fence post. Guillaume is noble in the way a damp log is noble, quiet, large, and utterly useless in a hurry. Nevertheless, he is now the central pillar of Etienne's grand escape. The plan is set. Etienne has memorized the route. The scarf is hidden under his mattress. The cellar door has been tested twice, but something isn't right. That Friday, during the evening meal, Father Bernard announces a surprise inspection of the abbey's personal belongings. To purify the soul, he says, though he manages to stare directly at Etienne while saying it. Panic sets in like cold porridge. That night, Etienne barely sleeps. His dreams are full of galloping ink blots and monks with pitchforks. In the morning, the inspection begins. Brother Louis finds the first letter. He claims he was dusting, which is ironic because no one has dusted that shelf since the First Crusade. The parchment, folded but unmistakable, flutters down like a leaf caught in divine judgment. Father Bernard reads it aloud, slowly, each word hanging like fog in the corridor. The phrases are harmless in isolation. Your eyes, sweet orchard, apple-stained fingers, but strung together they become damning, like a hymn with the verses shuffled into blasphemy. Etienne is summoned. The room is quiet. A breeze whistles through the narrow window. He stands there, trembling slightly, trying to recall the defense he rehearsed in his head, that it was a miscommunication, that the letter was poetic allegory, that perhaps some other Etienne was the intended recipient, but nothing comes out. Now, monks aren't known for dramatic confrontations. There's no shouting, just a long pause. Then a flurry of quiet activities, someone fetching Father Bernard's ledger, someone else bringing in a candle, despite it being broad daylight. Brother Henry offers to search Etienne's quarters just to be thorough. They find the rest of the letters, 12 in total, some still scented, one slightly nibbled by the cook's cat. The verdict is not officially declared that day, but the tone is set. Etienne is confined to his quarters. The scarf is confiscated. His inkwell is replaced with one that leaks. No one speaks to him except Brother Louis, who offers a passive-aggressive blessing and a half-rotten apple. The girl does not appear on Sunday. The orchard is empty. Guillaume stands near the fence, chewing something unidentifiable and glaring, as if this whole farce has deeply inconvenienced him. Etienne waits until dusk, then slips back inside, numb. That night, a bell rings. Not the usual one, not a prayer bell, but the deep iron clang that signals judgment. The last time it rang, it was for a novice who set fire to the wine cellar. Etienne's trial will begin at dawn. Dawn breaks with the kind of reluctant grey light that makes everything look more tragic than it is, as if the heavens themselves are unsure whether to judge or just go back to sleep. You rise with the others, though your limbs are heavier today, weighted down with shame, confusion, and the fact that last night's bread was almost definitely reused from last week. The monks file silently into the refectory, but instead of the usual dry scripture and boiled parsnips, you are directed into the chapter house, a cold stone room where judgment lives and windows are strictly ornamental. At the center is Father Bernard, seated like a crow watching for carrion, with two senior monks flanking him and one very bored-looking scribe twiddling a quill in the back. Etienne enters, wearing the same robe as always, but he looks smaller now, or maybe it's just the weight of 12 love letters pressing invisibly on his shoulders. Trials in monasteries aren't exactly courtroom dramas. There's no shouting objection or theatrical cross-examinations. It's more like an extended prayer group where everyone pretends they haven't already made up their minds. Father Bernard opens a scroll and begins reading, very slowly. The offences under review: violation of sacred vows, possession of unsanctioned correspondence, and the ever-vague improper use of orchard privileges. Etienne stands in silence. His defence, if it exists, is tucked somewhere behind his molars and refuses to come out. Instead, Brother Henry is invited to testify. He begins by pretending reluctance, but no one is fooled. He recounts, in painful detail, Etienne's late-night wanderings, his floral-smelling robes, his distracted sighs during Vespers, and the one time he was caught humming a secular melody that might have been about butter, but might have also been about love. Etienne does not deny any of it. Then comes the letters. Each one is read aloud, slowly, as if the words themselves might combust from embarrassment. The first is tame. I noticed your hand today, trembling slightly over the ink, but by the third, the room is shifting uncomfortably. The eighth one contains a metaphor involving beeswax and unspoken longing that makes even the scribe stop twiddling his quill. Father Bernard clears his throat so many times it starts to sound like a Gregorian chant remix. Still, no one laughs. This is serious. This is potentially scandalous. But it's also, weirdly, beautiful. Historians still argue whether some of the letters were edited posthumously to sound more poetic than they were, but even in their raw form, there's something tender, even sacred, about them. As if the soul of someone who wasn't quite meant to be a monk was trying to claw its way out with metaphors and badly drawn doves. The proceedings are interrupted when Brother Louis, of all people, requests to speak. This is unusual. Louis is known more for his ability to sleep through thunder than his participation in disciplinary matters. He steps forward, awkwardly, and says only this: I think he really did love her. It lands like a rock dropped into a still pond. Silence. Stretches. No one knows what to do with this admission, least of all Etienne, who looks more startled than grateful. Father Bernard frowns. The monks murmur, but no one contradicts it. After a brief recess which involves 3 monks pretending not to gossip while fetching teether, sentence is announced. Exile is considered, but ultimately deemed too dramatic. Imprisonment too costly. Instead, Etienne is assigned to the abbey's worst post, manure pit rotation and grave maintenance. It's not officially labeled as punishment, of course. It's called humbling reassignment, but everyone knows what it means. He is not to write. He is not to sing. And most importantly, he is not to speak to the girl again should she reappear. The abbey hopes, quietly, that she won't. You might think this would be the end of the story, that Etienne would slink off into a life of compost and silent regret. But fate, or perhaps just gossip, has other plans. The day after the verdict, a messenger arrives. He's clearly not from around here. His boots are polished, his cloak lined with fur, and he carries a scroll sealed in red wax bearing a crest no one at the abbey quite recognizes. He asks for Etienne by name, which raises every eyebrow in the building. Father Bernard accepts. The scroll breaks the seal and reads. He turns pale. The letter is from the girl, or rather, from her father. It turns out that Lady Rhubarb is actually the daughter of a merchant who supplies most of the abbeys. Luxury imports, saffron, figs, beeswax, and ironically parchment. The message is brief and barbed. It accuses the abbey of slander, mistreatment, and poor judgment. It demands Etienne be released from manual servitude and offered an apology. It threatens to withdraw all trade agreements if these conditions aren't met. Also, as a closing jab, it mentions that the girl is considering joining a convent that rivals Saint-Giraud in both piety and choir talent. The monks panic, though they try to do so quietly. Within a day, Etienne's duties shift mysteriously. From grave maintenance to garden assistance. 2 days later, he's seen back in the scriptorium. The abbey issues no official apology, but Etienne is quietly given access to his ink again, along with a new quill. Father Bernard begins a sudden campaign to improve diplomatic relationships with local families. Brother Henry receives a mysterious reassignment to a satellite priory in the marshlands. Brother Louis gets promoted for reasons no one understands. The girl does not return immediately, but the letters do. Slipped once again through the gate, this time folded into shapes: an apple, a flower, once even a tiny boot. The writing is bolder now, less coy. The final one in this chapter arrives folded inside a linen pouch with a small gold pin. It reads, "If they ever let you go, meet me in Bourges. I'll be the one eating a peach too early in the season." The abbey pretends, as abbeys often do, that nothing is amiss. Life returns to its well-worn grooves. Prayers echo off stone walls. Goats bleat in distant pastures, and the daily chores rotate with the grim rhythm of monastic duty. But for Etienne, everything tastes slightly different now, like soup made with a pinch too much hope. His exile has quietly ended, his quill returned. And though his official status remains novice with disciplinary history, no one dares speak the letters aloud anymore. Instead, they call it the incident, in the same tone one might use to describe a particularly dramatic cheese collapse during Lent. What few notice is that Etienne has not gone back to his old writing. The psalms he copies are pristine. Yes, but devoid of flair. The margins are empty. The ink is exact, like a man walking carefully across a frozen pond. but every so often he visits the orchard. Not during secret hours anymore, just in broad daylight, basket in hand, officially collecting apples. The tree where they once met still leans slightly to the left, bark scarred by time and squirrels. He pauses there longer than he should, pretending to inspect branches. One afternoon, tucked into the crook where two limbs meet, he finds it, a folded slip of parchment, barely held in place by a twig. No scent this time, no metaphor, just a single sentence. I was almost a nun. Still might be. Tempt me otherwise. And suddenly, the air tastes like scandal again. The monks pretend not to notice these orchard walks. Even Father Bernard, who once bristled at every scented breeze, has backed off. He's busy now preparing for a visit from the bishop, whispering. With his bursar about reputational risks and merchant relations, historians still argue whether the abbey's growing silence around Etienne was strategic, cowardly, or simply the path of least resistance. What is clear is this: the letters resumed, but the tone changed. Less courtly, more conspiratorial. Less about longing, more about plans. She writes of Bourgeois, a cousin with too many cats. Of a market square where vendors sell boiled pears and scandalous gloves. She writes of music drifting from windows and women who sell honey and tell fortunes on the side. She writes of Anne in Near the River, where no one asks questions and where the wine tastes of stolen afternoons. She signs off as You're Not Yet None, and Etienne responds, though less flamboyantly. His replies are cautious, folded tightly, always buried in the basket beneath the herbs. One night, as the bells toll softly over a foggy courtyard, Etienne makes a decision. Not the kind you yell into the heavens, but the kind that lodges behind your ribs and slowly rearranges your spine. He begins to plan not an escape this time, but something worse: patience. He starts doing everything right. His robes are immaculate. His prayers are punctual. He copies texts without flourish, tends to the ill without grumbling, and smiles even when Brother Louis accidentally knocks over his ink. It's unsettling. He's maturing, says one monk. He's plotting, says another. But no one dares interfere. Not after last time. Not with trade relationships still wobbling, and the bishop's carriage possibly arriving any week now. And then a minor miracle occurs. The abbot receives a letter not from the bishop, but from a lesser nobleman connected to the merchant family. It's an invitation. Apparently, the abbey has been selected to send one novice on a goodwill trip to Bourges to exchange knowledge and demonstrate the abbey's cultural refinement. It's a transparent olive branch disguised as diplomacy. And of course, they pick Etienne. Who else? Who better to charm the locals, soothe old tensions, and definitely not rekindle a forbidden romance under a fig tree? The announcement is made during evening prayer. Etienne bows, humbly, and accepts. The date is set. 2 weeks. Enough time for the road to dry. Enough time to pack some extra parchment. Enough time, he hopes, for her to be there. What no one realizes, not even Etienne, is that someone is still watching. Brother Henry, now supposedly transferred, hasn't truly left. He lingers at a nearby priory, still sending little notes back via a traveling candlemaker. He refers to Etienne as the romantic liability and remains obsessed with proving some deeper conspiracy. Historians still wonder if Henry's vendetta was born from jealousy, righteousness, or just a fundamental hatred of fruit-scented. Stationary, regardless, his influence seeps back into Saint-Giraud. He warns that the abbey's reputation might crumble. That romantic scandal, once tolerated, will breed only more chaos. His notes are intercepted eventually, but not before. They cause a stir. Father Bernard panics. Again, the trip to Bourget is not cancelled. Too late for that, but Etienne is now assigned a chaperone. Brother Louis, of all people, the one man least equipped to supervise anything beyond his own napping schedule. The monks sigh. Etienne sighs harder, but he says nothing. It's only a minor setback. Bourges is still real. She is still there. The journey begins before sunrise. Etienne and Louis ride in a modest cart filled with preserved herbs, blank scrolls, and one goat with a personality disorder. The road is long, bumpy, and flanked by fields waking slowly under a lavender sky. They stop at inns with suspicious stew, sleep under mossy awnings, and once share a bench with a troubadour who claims to have fathered 27 children and at least 2 revolutions. Etienne barely speaks. Louis hums off-key, and the days stretch. On the 4th day, they arrive. Bourges is bustling, fragrant with spring and livestock. Market stalls overflow with spices and lace. Children chase dogs. Monks look deeply out of place. But Etienne, for once, fits in. He knows what to look for. The square she described, the fig tree by the fountain, the man who sells roasted pears and gossips like a bard. And there she is. Not in disguise, not hiding. Just leaning casually against a cart of cherries, pretending not to notice him, but smiling anyway. They do not embrace, they don't dare, but their eyes meet, and everything else, the letters, the orchard, Guillaume's indifference, back like a wave made of secrets. Brother Louis buys a pair, oblivious. Etienne hands her a folded note. She tucks it away without reading. Later, he will learn she never read any of them in front of him. The waiting is part of the flavor. She'll say, "The thing about secret reunions in public markets is that they are never as cinematic as you'd hope. There's no soaring loop music, no conveniently timed breeze-tousling hair in just the right way, and absolutely no guarantee that the goat tethered nearby won't start bleating during your eye contact. But somehow, despite the noise, the bustle, and Brother Louis loudly haggling over a questionable onion tart, the moment sticks. You and she no longer cloaked, no longer just imagined exist again in the same space, not as ink on parchment, or half-remembered orchard giggles, but as 2 real people trying very hard not to smile too obviously. She's wearing green, with little embroidered vines along the sleeves. You wonder if she sewed them herself, or if some scandalous aunt gave it to her. Either way, it suits her. She raises an eyebrow at your plain monk's robe, and says quietly, "Didn't pack the scarf." You manage not to choke on air. She laughs. It's still the same laugh, half mirth, half defiance. You can't talk long. That much is obvious. Brother Louis is now sampling an alarming blue cheese, while mumbling something about divine fermentation, and several local merchants have already started whispering about the pretty monk and the spicy girl with opinions. She slips you a small folded note, no sent this time, but the paper is soft, folded crisply into a triangle. She murmurs, "Read it by candlelight, and don't drop wax on it like last time." Then she's gone, slipping behind a barrel of dried lentils and disappearing into the alleyway as if she's been doing it her whole life. Maybe she has. That night, in the small guest cell provided by a sympathetic monk who owes your abbey exactly 3 favors and 1 jar of stolen fig jam, you open the note. It's simple. A map, sketched hastily, showing the way to a small house near the river. A time just before dawn, and 3 words scrawled in the corner. No regrets, monk. You stare at it for a long time. The candle sputters. Brother. Louis snores in the corner like a hay-stuffed accordion. You trace the map again, already memorizing every turn. You don't sleep, or rather, you pretend to sleep while your brain drafts half a dozen escape plans. At one point you consider dressing Louis in your robe and hoping no one notices, but dismiss that as overly theatrical and frankly a bit rude. Instead, you rise quietly when the bells toll once, the hour when even sins move slowly. You slip out, heart pounding in your throat, boots softer than memory. The city is still asleep, save for a few cats and one extremely judgmental rooster. You follow the map. It leads you through crooked lanes and across a tiny bridge that groans like it's got secrets. Finally, you find it. A modest cottage with ivy strangling the fence and a shutter slightly ajar. You knock once, then twice. She opens the door with a look that says about time and steps aside. Inside, the air smells like dried lavender and something warm baking. There's no fireplace roaring, no dramatic lighting, just a small table, a window seat, and one too many cushions for any purely platonic setting. She hands you tea before you can say a word. You sit, you breathe. She finally says, "So, what do monks dream of, besides ink and apples?" You talk, you tell her about the Abbey, about Louis, about the trial and the manure pit and the whispered verdict. You tell her about Gijim, the worst horse in France, and how you honestly miss him. She tells you about her family, her nearly arranged marriage to a man who wore too much velvet and smelled like boiled onions, and about her cousin who once eloped with a traveling glassblower. "I wanted to be brave like that," she says, staring into her teacup. "Turns out, I needed a monk for that." You don't know what to say to that, so you don't. You just reach across the table and take her hand. For the first time, she lets you. Historians still argue what happened in the days following that moment. Some say Etienne never returned to the Abbey. Others insist he did, only to quietly resign a year later under the guise of pursuing hermitage. One theory claims he was offered a teaching position at a small monastery library where rules were loose and poetry was tolerated. But the letters from that time are vague, sometimes contradictory. What is certain is that after that morning in Bourget, everything changed. Because here's what no one expected. The scandal grew legs, not just in Saint-Giraud, but in other abbeys too. Other novices began copying love poems into their margins. One scribe in Toulouse was caught carving initials into a hymn board. The church tried, briefly, to stamp it out, declaring a renewed emphasis on chastity, banning unsupervised orchard visits, even attempting to censor certain metaphors, but it was too late. The tale of the monk and the merchant's daughter had spread, and with it came a soft rebellion, not violent, not loud, but persistent, a whisper in the margins of devotion, a reminder that love, like ink, has a way of seeping into everything back in Saint-Giraud. The abbey began to change. Slowly, quietly, the orchard, once off-limits, was reopened for supervised contemplation. The scriptorium allowed the return of illuminated borders, so long as they depicted saints, vines, or animals with no obvious innuendo. Father Bernard stepped down not long after the bishop's inspection, citing health concerns and unresolved correspondence issues. Brother Henry, still bitter, ended up running a very quiet priory in a very damp region. Brother Louis became famous for inventing a new style of cheese wrapping that involved psalms and wax paper. As for Etienne, well, that depends on whom you ask, Some say he returned one final time to the orchard, just to see if the tree was still blooming. Others claim he and the girl bought a small house by the river and ran a bookshop that sold poetry disguised as theology. One particularly poetic monk claimed to have seen them once, years later, riding on a cart pulled by a horse that looked suspiciously like Guillaume toward the sea. The monk said they looked happy, like two people who had lived 1,000 lives inside folded letters. You don't expect a welcome party when you return to the abbey, and true to form, you don't get one. The gates creak open, as they always do, sounding like the world's oldest violin warming up for a funeral. The courtyard smells of old hay, and something recently boiled, possibly both on purpose. Brother Louis walks ahead of you, cheerfully oblivious, whistling a half-remembered hymn and tossing his leftover cheese to the courtyard chickens, who respond with the kind of excitement typically reserved for divine miracles. You, however, carry only your satchel, a few extra pages of your own scribbling tucked inside, and a folded note from her you haven't stopped rereading for 4 straight days. You're back, not because you wanted to be, but because sometimes a return is part of the plan, even when the plan no longer makes perfect sense. The abbey greets you with suspicious efficiency. No lectures, no long sighs. Just a nod from the new prior, portly man with sympathetic eyebrows, an instruction to report back to the scriptorium at your usual hour. It's as if the past few months have been erased, except now your ink pot is always full and your seat comes with a better candle. The other monks avoid your eyes, but not in a cruel way, more like the way people avoid looking at someone who survived something they themselves couldn't have endured. You get the sense that no one wants to ask about Bourges. That's fine. You wouldn't tell them the truth anyway. The orchard is still there. The tree leans a little further now, but the scar on its bark from that long-ago chessboard is still visible. You start visiting again, always with a basket, always alone. Sometimes you just sit. Sometimes you write. Not letters, exactly, not anymore, but thoughts. Pieces of days. Bits of her laughter that you don't want to forget. Occasionally, you imagine her walking up behind you, grabbing your apple without asking, and making fun of your robe again. It's comforting, even when it hurts. And then, one afternoon, something changes. You find a letter, not a folded parchment, tucked into a tree or slipped through the herb fence, but something placed carefully on your scriptorium desk. It's unsigned, it's brief. She's in Narbonne. The convent is temporary. You have time. There's no indication of who sent it. You ask around, casually, but no one admits anything. Brother Louis winks and says, "Maybe the Holy Spirit delivers now." You don't laugh, but you don't deny the possibility either. You begin to plot again, but more quietly this time. No great escape, no dramatic midnight rides, just a path, a possibility. Narbonne is far, but not unreachable. If you request reassignment, say for theological research or teaching a soft exile, you might be able to go. You start behaving more, ... Abbey approved. You help Brother Henry's replacement shelve manuscripts. You correct a few errors in the Psalter with humility, not smugness. You even attend extra prayers. It doesn't go unnoticed. The prior praises your renewed spirit. You smile and thank him without rolling your eyes. Historians still argue whether this new obedience was genuine or strategic. Some say Etienne had simply grown up. Others believe he was waiting for the right moment to disappear, and obedience was the best disguise. What we know is that within 3 months, a request comes through. A convent in Narbonne requires a temporary scribe. Their usual one had taken ill, and they were falling behind in their manuscript copying. Saint-Giraud, eager to rebuild its good name and reduce certain tensions, volunteers Etienne with suspicious speed. You were told it's a short-term assignment, just a season or two. More of a courtesy than a calling, the prior says. You nod. You don't trust your voice to respond. The journey is long, but easier this time. You travel light, with only one trunk and a small box of ink. No goat, no Louis. Just you, the road, and an increasingly warm breeze that carries the scent of olives and rosemary. You arrive in Narbonne just before dusk, the sky the color of ripe figs, and the convent greets you with polite detachment. You are not the first monk they've hosted. You likely won't be the last. You are given a cell with a view of a dusty courtyard and an assignment to begin copying psalms by morning. The work is familiar, meditative even, but your eyes wander. You watch the nuns crossing the courtyard, heads bowed, habits fluttering like quiet flags. You don't know which one is her, or if she's still here, or if she even acknowledged you. Days pass, then a week, then another, and still nothing. You begin to wonder if the letter was a mistake, if she's already gone, or worse, changed. Her mind, you remind yourself that silence does not mean absence. But it's hard, and then, one morning, you find it. Not a letter, a book. Left on your desk, misfiled, clearly not part of your current task. A volume of poetry, secular, romantic, barely disguised as theological. You flip it open, heart stalling. Inside the cover is a single pressed violet and a line written in the margin. Even saints need footnotes. Come find me. You read it 3 times. Then you close the book and begin searching. You don't make a scene. You wait until the midday bell, when most of the convent is gathered in the main chapel, and you walk the halls slowly, looking for a clue. You find her near the library, sorting scrolls. She doesn't look up, doesn't speak, but as you pass, she drops a ribbon, green, familiar. You pick it up. She doesn't take it back. Later, you find another note, this time hidden inside a manuscript about the lives of desert hermits. It reads, "Meet me in the West Garden. Bring ink. I have words." That night, under a sky smeared with stars and the distant scent of bread, cooling somewhere nearby, you sit beside her on a low stone wall, inkpot between you. She doesn't say hello, just starts writing. You do too, not to each other, not right away, just ... writing words. Shared silently, passed back and forth, each page a piece of something you're rebuilding. It's not as thrilling as Orchard, Rendezvous, or as romantic as secret horse-drawn escapes, but it's deeper, it's quieter, it's real. You begin to settle into Narbonne like ink, sinking slowly into old vellum. The convent, once a maze of unfamiliar rhythms and unspoken rules, begins to soften around you. The nuns no longer glance at you with suspicion or curiosity. You are now just another part of the quiet machinery you're scraping quill, as expected as the tolling bells. Days pass in a kind of velvety blur, the slow copying of texts, the sorting of fragile parchments, the occasional repair of a crumbling spine. But in between those tasks, she is there, not always in plain sight, and never in any way that would spark gossip or invite punishment, but always present. Sometimes she brushes past you, carrying scrolls that smell faintly of mint. Sometimes she leaves pages open at certain poems, knowing you'll be the one to shelve them. Once, she even scrawled a limerick in the margin of a commentary on Saint Jerome. Just absurd enough to make you snort out loud and pretend it was a sneeze. You begin writing again, but not to her, not directly. You write poems that could be prayers, and prayers that could be apologies. You bind them into blank books that you stack in the back corner of your work table, pretending they're drafts for the bishop. Some pages disappear. You pretend not to notice. She pretends not to. Return them. There's an understanding between you now, carved carefully over weeks. Nothing will be said aloud unless absolutely necessary. Love is still there, yes, but spoken only in silences, in glances held just a breath too long, in the way she always sits with her back to the wind so your pages don't blow away. It's less about rebellion now, more about survival. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolls over the city, sudden and theatrical, the kind of storm that shakes shutters and floods flower pots. You're both trapped in the library, the other scribes having scattered like dry leaves. She closes a book she's not reading and says, "Tell me something you haven't written down." You freeze, then breathe, then answer. You tell her about your mother's old song about geese and grain. You tell her about the first time you tried to write a poem and rhymed love with dove and thought it was brilliant. You tell her that you hated copying Leviticus, not because of the laws, but because the ink always smudged. She laughs and tells you something too, that she once tried to run away, not for love, but for silence, that sometimes the convent is lonelier than the orchard, that she once kissed a boy just to see if he tasted like the letters he wrote. He didn't. You feel a surge of strange, smug joy. Historians still argue whether this phase of Etienne's life was the happiest, or simply the calm before yet another storm. Records from the convent in Narbonne mention a visiting scholar with suspiciously good penmanship and a novice with a dangerous love of secular verse. One complaint filed anonymously to a bishop even references moonlit strolls among the thyme plants, though no names are given. The convent, for its part, does not press the issue. As long as the scrolls are copied, the work is done, and the nuns aren't breaking any visible rules. No one wants a scandal, especially not after what happened in Saint-Giraud. But the thing about quiet happiness is that it draws attention. Word spreads. Other convents request copies of your pages, curious about the poetic annotations said to soothe the soul. A prior from a nearby monastery sends a letter asking for your insights on combining liturgy with narrative structure. And then, inevitably, your past catches up. A letter arrives at the convent, addressed formally but clearly from Saint-Giraud. It's polite, distant, and full of faint praise. It requests your return. Not urgently, not with any implied punishment, just a gentle recall, a reminder that your time in Narbonne was always temporary. The letter closes with a phrase you once used to end a particularly dramatic sermon. Let no word go unwitnessed. You show it to her without saying anything. She reads it once, twice, then places it gently between the pages of a psalter and says, "They won't stop, you know. Unless you vanish." You nod. You've been thinking the same thing. Escape isn't the right word. Neither is rebellion. What you want is freedom, not from the Abbey or from vows, but from this constant returning, this orbit of expectation. That night, you write a final letter. It's not addressed to Saint-Giraud, nor to her. It's addressed to yourself. A farewell to a life that was never quite yours. You leave the convent before dawn, not alone. She walks with you to the edge of the road, where a merchant cart is due to pass at sunrise. She hands you a bundle, some bread, a few coins, a ribbon that once held her hair back during windy copying sessions. You hand her a book of your poems, just enough innuendo to be interesting, just enough theology to be safe. You kiss her forehead. She doesn't cry, but you'd think she might later. You promise to write. She promises not to wait, and somehow that feels fair. The cart takes you south, toward the coast, where new towns don't ask questions and old abbots don't send letters. You end up in a fishing village, where no one cares that your Latin is perfect and your handwriting looks suspiciously divine. You teach children how to shape letters. You help mend nets. You copy stories into ledgers for merchants who can't spell. You grow older, not old, just older. Enough that when people ask where you came from, you say up north, and they don't ask more. Every so often, you receive a parcel, never with a return address. Inside, a pressed flower, a recipe for soup, a poem with 3 words underlined. Once, just once, a lock of hair wrapped in green ribbon. You never write back. Not because you don't want to, but because you already said everything. The rest is just footnotes. Years pass like slow-moving ink across an old page, never quite straight, never entirely predictable, but always drifting toward something finished. You remain in the fishing village longer than you expect. What begins as a convenient escape gradually becomes something softer, something resembling a home. The people there don't care that you once copied psalms, or that your posture suggests a lifetime of quiet judgment. They care that you repair the torn pages of old contracts, that your letters to the governor get a response, and that you know how to make an herbal balm that soothes sunburn from too many hours mending sails. You sleep above a bookshop, now one, barely kept alive by a widow who likes to read aloud to her cat, and once offered you a job in exchange for alphabetizing her romance section. You accepted immediately. You told her you used to know a girl who lived between metaphors. She raised an eyebrow and never asked what happened to her. But you remember, always, not every day. Not with a sense of loss exactly, but like a song that resurfaces when the wind hits the shutters just right. Some days, when the sea is calm and the gulls aren't shrieking like cursed nuns, you reread the last letter she ever sent, the one with the pressed time and the line, "Sometimes love doesn't need a witness, just a quiet place to rest." You've never stopped loving her, but you've also never tried to find her. Maybe you understood something fundamental the day you left Narban, that love, to survive, sometimes needs distance, that not every story needs a reunion, that some gardens are best left untrampled. Still, you keep writing. Not to her, but not to her either. The locals bring you scraps of paper, fragments of stories, records of births and debts and fish weights. You write them all down. Sometimes you slip in a line of poetry just to see if anyone notices. They never do, except once, when a child with too many questions asked you, "Why does this receipt say, 'I dreamed of figs again last night'?" You told him it was a secret code. He told everyone. The village now thinks you're part of a smuggler's network. You don't correct them. One day, a man arrives, not from the north, from the east. He wears clerical robes, but they're dusty, travel-worn, the kind only worn by someone who once believed in rules but now mostly believes in good boots. He introduces himself as Brother Allard, says he's heard of you, that your handwriting is still discussed in certain abbeys, that someone, somewhere, is trying to compile all your annotations into a single volume titled The Marginalia of a Wayward Monk. You laugh. You don't stop laughing for nearly 5 minutes. Brother Allard doesn't laugh. He says, "They think you're dead." You shrug. Let them. But Allard has a proposition. He's part of a small order, a kind of wandering library. They move from town to town, teaching literacy, preserving crumbling manuscripts, smuggling poetry into sermons. He wants you to join them. Says your experience, your skills, your colorful past would be useful. You ask how many rules they have. He says, "Only 2. Never correct someone's memory, and always carry spare ink." You accept your life changes again. You begin traveling, slowly, deliberately, with no real destination, but always a purpose. 1 month, you're in a mountain village, repairing a wedding contract that someone's goat had partially eaten. The next, you're in a port town, reciting parables under lantern light for children who'd never seen a book up close. You sleep where you can, sometimes in barns, sometimes in abandoned watchtowers, once in a bed made entirely of hay and regret. But always, you write notes, observations, tiny poems on the back of fish wrapping. You leave them behind like breadcrumbs. No one will follow. One spring, in a dusty town near the Pyrenees, you find yourself in a market not unlike the one in Bourget. Same sense. Overripe fruit, overly confident cheese. Same chaos. You walk past a stall selling ink, and your hand freezes. There, sitting in a crate of blank paper, is a book, thin, bound in green thread, with no title. You lift it. Inside, her handwriting, poems, some you've never read, some you wrote, others she must have dreamed. You turn to the last page. It reads, "If you find this, I hope you're still writing. If not for me, then for the version of us that never had to leave." You don't cry, but your breath catches like a candle guttering in wind. You ask the stall owner where the book came from. He shrugs. Says a woman sold it to him. Said someone would come for it. Didn't say who. You buy the book. Walk away. Slowly, that night, you copy her final poem into your own journal. Below it, you write, still writing, "Historians will never find this book." It ends up buried in a library no one catalogues, on a shelf mislabeled as agricultural records. But somewhere, a novice monk will stumble upon it and read a line that feels too modern, too raw. He'll ask his mentor who wrote it. The mentor will say, "Just a scribe. No one important." But the novice will remember it, and he'll start writing, too. Years begin to pile like parchment in a forgotten drawer creased. Faded, but still legible if you know how to read between the lines. You find yourself slowing down. Not in mind. Your thoughts still leap and tumble like candle flames, but your hands ache after a day's writing. Your knees complain on long walks. And you've started muttering things under your breath, like this ink was better 3 decades ago. Which is how you know you're becoming what you once rebelled against. A relic, though hopefully a useful one. The traveling library keeps moving, and so do you, albeit with a bit more grumbling when the terrain gets steep or the mules act superior. You teach when you're asked. Mostly, you listen. Sometimes, you find someone who needs more than literacy. They need a story, a memory that isn't theirs, but could be. Those are the moments that keep your bones moving. Not truth, necessarily, but narrative gently shaped, softly offered. One such moment comes in a town so small it doesn't bother with a name. Just a fork in the road to Wells, and a stone chapel that leans like it's trying to hear better. A girl, there 16, eyes full of questions, hair full of leaves, asks, "If it's true monks once fell in love." You pause, smile, say some. Still do, she says. But aren't they supposed to be married to God? You think of all the letters, the orchard, the way your hand shook when she laughed too loudly near the figs. Even marriage, you say, needs footnotes. She doesn't understand, but she nods as if she might one day at night. You stay in the chapel loft, just under the rafters where old bats whisper secrets. You reread her last book, now covered in your own annotations. You've started answering her poems in the margins, not because you expect anyone to read them, but because the conversation never really ended. One poem references the orchard. You respond, "It bloomed one last time after you left," like it missed the scandal. Another poem dreams of escaping by sea. You write, "The waves make terrible metaphors. They always repeat themselves." Somewhere along the way, you stop caring if the ink smudges. Historians still debate your authorship. Some claim the collected works of Brother E are the scribbles of multiple monks. Others think you are a fiction created by a bored librarian with romantic inclinations and a knack for calligraphy. A few believe you were real, but that your love was platonic, spiritual, metaphorical, because the alternative is too messy, too human. The truth, of course, is somewhere in the ink between all that. You once loved someone, you never quite stopped, and you told the story the only way you knew how. Sideways, you returned to Saint-Giraud only once, and even then, by accident. The abbey is barely recognizable. The outer wall has crumbled in places, ivy devouring the cloister. A new order runs it, now stricter, quieter, less inclined toward poetic scandal. You walk past the orchard. The tree is gone, replaced by a perfectly symmetrical herb garden. Practical, bland, you nod. Then drop a folded poem near the basil and keep walking. You don't knock. You don't want to be remembered. You just want to make sure no one forgets. What happened there? Not exactly, but enough to know that love once bloomed between stone and silence. In a nearby village, you rest for a week. There's a festival, something involving goats and honey and an alarming amount of flutes. You sit under an awning, sipping something fermented, and a woman in her 40 shafted beside you. She says, "You're the one who writes about figs." You raise an eyebrow. She laughs, says, "My mother used to read your letters to me, never said who they were from, just that they mattered." You ask her name. She says, "No one you're looking for," and somehow that's true and not true at the same time. The following morning, you rise before the sun and leave the town behind, leaving a copy of one of your favorite letters wrapped in the scarf she forgot. It's not a romantic gesture. It's just tradition now. Eventually you stop traveling, not because you're tired, though you are, but because the road finally gives you a place that feels like a closing chapter. It's a village near a river, quiet but not lonely. There's a small school, a bakery that insists on naming its loaves after saints, a library the size of a stable but filled with light. You take a room above it, surrounded by words not your own, and for the first time in decades, you begin writing something for yourself. Not poems, not letters, a story. Yours, the real one, or at least the one you choose to remember. You begin with, "She smelled like peaches." That was the first problem. You laugh when you write it. Then you keep going. The pages pile up, not neatly, not quickly, but they come. You write about the abbey, about the orchard, about Giddom, the entirely useless horse, about the way she said your name like it was a secret you hadn't earned yet. You don't name her, not once, because that part was never for the world, just for you. One evening, a child wanders into the library. She asks if you're the man who used to write prayers that sounded like bedtime stories. You nod. She asks if you'll write one about her cat. You do. She tells everyone. Soon, the village children come weekly, bringing stories, asking for theirs to be told. You begin teaching them how to write their own carefully, crookedly, full of errors and wonder. You don't tell them who you were, but they know you love words. That's enough. And one night, years later, when the ink runs dry mid-sentence, and your hands finally say no more, you lie back, close your eyes, and remember her laugh. Not the letters, not the orchard, just that sound. It's still enough to make you smile. You never meant for any of it to last, and yet the strange, quiet irony of life is that the things you don't intend often linger the longest. Your name becomes a rumor in that riverside village, the monk with the library, the old man who writes the dreams of cats, the one who once loved a woman made of ink and orchard breeze. The stories spread, as they always do, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are warm. And in a world that rarely offers warmth without condition, that's enough to keep people talking. The children grow as they tend to, and the ones you taught begin teaching others, misquoting your metaphors and giggling about the time you tried to write a lullaby about turnips. You don't correct them. Every retelling makes you a little more mythical and a little less responsible for the details. What you do hold on to are the habits. You still rise before the sun, out of some ancient monastic muscle memory, and still spend the first hour of the day in silence. Not praying exactly, not anymore, but listening. To the birds, the creak of the roof beams, the wind worrying. At the shutters, sometimes, if you listen hard enough, you swear you can hear her laughing faintly at the way you still forget to cross your T's when you're tired. You've stopped writing full letters. Instead, you jot down lines, fragments, sentences that start like they're going somewhere, but happily don't. You tuck them into books, slip them into loaves of bread at the bakery, once even tied one to the leg of a confused pigeon. You don't expect them to be found. You just like leaving pieces of yourself behind. One spring, a traveling scholar arrives in the village. She's young, sharp-eyed, carrying a satchel full of crumbling texts and boundless enthusiasm. She's cataloguing forgotten writings of the region and has heard rumors of a poet monk who never signed his work but left trails like breadcrumbs. You invite her for tea. She stays for hours, reads your old journal pages with a reverence you hadn't expected. She asks if the woman in the poems was real. You say, more than most saints. She nods, doesn't press. At the end of her stay, she asks if she can copy one of your stories. You say yes. She chooses the one with the orchard, of course. Historians later discover that manuscript, bound in worn leather, tucked into a box mislabeled local sermons. They scan it, digitize it, upload it onto databases that make your words float across glowing rectangles centuries later. One user comments, "This sounds like love, but older." Another says, "Reminds me of the time I left someone before. I knew how to stay." Your words reach farther than your feet ever did, and somehow that feels right. Still, none of that matters to you now. You've grown comfortably forgetful. You lose track of days, but never lose your place in a story. The children now visit just to hear you hum while you write. One boy brings you wild thyme for your tea. Another carves you a wooden ink pot, badly misshapen but deeply earnest. You keep it beside your bed. One rainy evening, a woman arrives at The library just as you're about to lock up. She's cloaked, hood low, dripping water across your floor. You offer her a towel. She refuses. Instead, she opens her satchel and pulls out a book. Familiar binding, familiar scent. She lays it gently on the desk and says, "This was my mother's. She said it came from someone who loved her more in silence than in songs." You don't speak. She flips to the last page. "She wanted me to bring it to you. Said you'd know what to do with it." Then, just as quietly, she leaves. You don't follow. The book is hers. The one with the poems. The one she never let. You see, in full. You run your hands over the pages like they might answer you, and in a way, they do. On the final page, a line written in a trembling hand. "I stopped waiting for you long ago, but I never stopped hoping you remembered the orchard." You do. You always have. That night, you stay up late, copying that final line onto new parchment, over and over, until your hand aches and the ink runs thin. The next morning, you give the original to the baker's daughter, tell her to keep it somewhere, dry, and make her promise not to sell it to passing poets. She agrees, barely understanding the weight of what she's been given. You don't explain. Some legacies are meant to be stumbled into. Weeks pass, the rains come and go. You begin walking, with a cane, not out of need, but because it makes you feel like a wizard. The children approve. One even draws you as a scroll mage. You pin the drawing to your wall. Next to it, a sketch of her you once attempted from memory. It's bad her nose is too long, and you've forgotten the exact curve of her chin, but it's close enough. You call it fig spirit. She'd hate it. She'd laugh at it. That's why you keep it. Eventually, the days grow shorter again. The breeze carries hints of thyme, apples, and that damp smell old abbeys always had. You begin to sleep more, dream deeper. In one dream, you're back in the orchard, only now it's filled with letters instead of fruit. She's there, of course, sorting them into piles, to flowery, try again, good metaphor, terrible Latin. You wake laughing. When the time finally comes, it's not dramatic. You're not mid-sentence or in the middle of a final masterpiece. You're in your chair, watching the sun spill across the floor like melted gold. A letter rests on your lap, unwritten, but that's fine. Some things don't need words anymore. The village mourns in the only way it knows how. Gently, quietly, with far too much bread. They do not hold a grand funeral. You would have hated that. Instead, they gather at the library, the children pressing wrinkled poems into your empty chair, some misspelled, some incomprehensible, but all blooming with effort. The baker hangs a green ribbon in the window. The widow who once hired you to alphabetize her romances wears a black shawl stitched with violets. No one reads a eulogy. No one needs to. Your stories are still on the shelves, in the notebooks of children, etched into the memory of every quiet afternoon. Someone spent listening to you hum about turnips or lost love. They bury you beneath the fig tree you once planted behind the library. It had never fruited properly until that spring. The villagers take it as a sign. One child claims to have seen you sitting beneath it the morning after your death, writing something in the dirt with your cane. No one believes him, but they still avoid stepping near that patch of soil, just in case. Months pass. The scholar who once visited returns, now with a companion, another curious academic, this one obsessed with obscure monastic writings and forgotten marginalia. They spend a week cataloguing your papers, arguing over what to include in a small anthology they're compiling. They call it Ink in the Orchard, the lost letters of a monastic dreamer. You would have rolled your eyes at the title, but secretly liked it. They include your poems, the ones scribbled in margins, the fragments you left in books, even the turnip lullaby now, cited as an early example of agricultural surrealism. They don't find everything, of course. Not the letter hidden behind the floorboard in the northwest corner of the library. Not the coded verses etched on the underside of the reading bench. Not the pressed flower you tucked into the pages of your first journal, the one that still smells faintly of her. But that's how you wanted it. The best stories aren't the ones fully told. They're the ones that live in the gaps, the silences between pages, the breath before someone dares to say, "Wait, there's more." Meanwhile, far from the village, another woman walks slowly along the edge of a cliffside path, a green scarf knotted loosely around her neck. Her hair has grayed in streaks, her hands bear the lines of ink and time, but her posture remains stubbornly upright. She carries a small book under her arm, one of your early ones, worn and rebound more than once. She stops beside a stone bench, overlooking the sea, and opens it to the last page. There, in your handwriting, are the final words you ever addressed to her. Not "I love you," not goodbye, just "still writing." She smiles, closes the book, and begins to hum a tune no one else has ever heard. You see, despite the best efforts of historians to organize lives into neat timelines and polished conclusions, real stories, especially love stories, rarely end in one place. They echo, they ripple outward. Your words, though quiet, leave marks. In the next generation of scribes who draw hearts in the margins when no one's looking. In the convents that begin allowing poetry into their prayer books again. In the Abbey of Saint-Giraud, now partially restored, where a small plaque reads, "Etienne, scribe and dreamer, loved once, wrote always." They never recover the full account. Too many pages lost to time, too many letters burned, buried, or eaten by goats with questionable taste in literature. But the pieces that survive are enough. Enough to tell a story. Enough to remind readers centuries later that once, in a world bound by rules and rituals, a young monk and a merchant's daughter exchanged letters under the boughs of an orchard, and changed everything by daring to write what they felt. And that, in the end, is the strange magic of history. It forgets so much, but remembers just enough to keep the rest alive. Somewhere, a novice monk copies a psalm and adds a flourish to the P because he once read that a scribe named Etienne did the same. Somewhere else, a schoolgirl copies your poem into the back of her spelling book, not knowing who wrote it. Only that it made her feel like figs could mean something again and far away, in a different kind of orchard, less wild, more managed. Fig tree leans gently toward the sun, its branches heavy with fruit. A woman picks one, tastes it, and thinks, briefly, of a letter she once wrote. One that said too little and too much all at once. She finishes the fruit, wipes her hands on her scarf, and walks back inside, where a student waits for their next lesson. She teaches them about metaphor that day. She does not mention your name, but she writes it on the board, backwards, in a sentence she knows they won't quite understand yet. Someday they will. Time, as always, marches forward with the dignity of a half-asleep donkey, stubborn, slow, and occasionally braying just to remind you it's still there. Decades pass, and your story once whispered in orchard, shadows and buried in the folds of old letters, starts to grow roots beyond your control. In universities, where ink now comes in bottles with warning labels and students write with thumbs instead of quills, someone stumbles upon your name in a digital archive. It's not the name itself that catches their attention, it's the footnote. The one that reads, possible author of the disputed Saint-Giraud correspondence scandal, circa 14th century. Scandal is still an excellent bait, even when it's been aged for 700 years. A thesis is written, then another. One scholar claims you were a tragic figure who succumbed to temptation. Another argues you were a proto-feminist writing under a false identity. A third insists you were never real, just a convenient myth stitched together from the fragments of bored monks and lonely women who needed something to believe in. Conferences are held, panels convene, someone even stages a dramatic reading of your orchard letters set to the gentle rustling of fig leaves and faint lute music. It's deeply awkward, but also strangely beautiful. In the village where you died, little changes. The library still stands, its shelves uneven, its windows smudged by curious children's faces. The fig tree thrives. During harvest, the locals hang folded slips of paper from its branches, messages, wishes, tiny poems scrawled in crooked letters. They call it Fig Sunday. No one remembers exactly when it started, but everyone participates. 1 year, a note simply reads, still. Writing. No one claims it. No one removes it. A group of schoolchildren begins writing their own monastic drama, loosely based on your story, though they replace the orchard with a space station and the girl with a time-traveling librarian who carries love letters in a mechanical owl. It's charming. You'd be proud. The boy who plays you insists on wearing a robe 2 sizes too large and dramatically whispering his lines to a potted basil plant. The teacher says it's interpretive. The crowd loves it. Somewhere else, in a city library built with more glass than stone, a researcher stumbles upon a box mislabeled trade receipts, South Coast villages. Inside, she finds what she later describes in her journal as a tangle of heartbreak and ink stains. Dozens of your fragments, preserved by accident. Tiny poems written on the backs of fish weights, fig orders, and marginalia from legal documents. She doesn't know your full story, but she feels it. She begins compiling. She doesn't publish, not yet. She just copies them into her own journal, adding sketches beside the man apple here, a candle there, a boot, a scarf, a horse who looks decidedly unimpressed. The world keeps missing the full picture, but it doesn't matter anymore, because it's still moving. You're still moving. And what of her? Well, stories have a way of protecting those who never asked to be remembered. Her name remains missing from most accounts, replaced by nicknames Lady Rhubarb, the cloaked one, the girl with too many names. But traces emerge. A merchant's ledger with a familiar handwriting style, a poem sewn into the lining of a travelling cloak, a recipe for apple pastries signed only with a green wax seal and a faint whiff of peaches, somehow still lingering. She never becomes a legend. She becomes something gentler, an echo, a metaphor passed from writer to writer like a secret ingredient no one can quite describe, but everyone knows makes the dish feel like home. One convent near Narbonne keeps a collection of letters too sentimental to be doctrinal. They're catalogued simply as unorthodox devotion. A nun there swears she once saw a woman light a candle, place a folded poem on the altar, and whisper, "This one was for him." She wore green. She left before anyone could ask her name. And still, your words ripple. A young poet in reads one of your orchard stanzas, carved into a public bench. He copies it onto his arm, tattoos it 2 years later. A playwright in Bruges finds your letters bound into a romantic comedy involving cheese, theft, and mistaken identity. A teenage girl in Lisbon recites your moonlit apology to a pomegranate and wins her school's literary prize. You are no longer a person. You are texture, mood, the softness before a confession, the long pause after someone says, "I think. I used to love you." Eventually, someone will try to film it. A historical drama, perhaps. They'll cast an actor with sorrowful eyes and perfect posture to play you. They'll find an actress who smirks just right, dresses her in brown cloaks, and makes her flirt like it's an act of rebellion. They'll argue for months over the ending. Does he die in her arms? Do they escape together on the world's slowest horse? Or does he remain behind, cloistered and forgotten, until she returns with a forged papal pardon and a dramatic monologue? They'll choose a bittersweet ending, of course, the kind that gets awards, but none of it will be quite right, because the truth is simpler, smaller, and more difficult to pin down. You loved, she loved. You wrote, she read. And between the lines, between the candles and the ink and the half-stolen apples, you built a space that lived longer than either of you. And now, even now, someone, somewhere, is hearing this for the first time, lights low, wrapped in a blanket, perhaps thinking of someone they once knew or never met. They might not remember your name. They might not remember the details, but they'll remember the feeling. That quiet thrill of something forbidden, soft, and utterly sincere. They'll think of a letter never sent, a voice never quite forgotten, a tree that bent just enough to let two people hide beneath it. And maybe, just maybe, they'll fall asleep thinking, I should write that down. The strangest thing about immortality is that you almost never notice it happening. You live your life, scribbling in margins, falling in and out of love with metaphors and herbs and one too many mispronounced Latin hymns, and then centuries later, your name reel or mangled is whispered in rooms with fluorescent lights and heating vents. Your words, preserved by accident more than intention, become bookmarks in lives you will never know. But long before that, before you became the literary version of a thumbprint smudged across history's glass, you were just Etienne. Just a boy in a robe that itched, who liked apples too much and silence too little, who thought love might be worth the risk of damnation, or at least a very uncomfortable sermon. And what a relief it is to remember that, because in this quiet part of the story, well past the peak of scandal and into the soft decline of days lived slowly, you begin to realize something that might have frightened your younger self. It's okay that most people don't know who you were. It's even better, perhaps, that they don't know her name. What you shared wasn't meant to be paraded in stained glass or immortalized in a saint's calendar. It was meant to live, like all good things do, in the soil, in the breath between lines, in the space under fig leaves and folded sheets of parchment. You are not legend, you are footnote, and that is more than enough. One morning, decades after your last letter, a student monk finds one of your old notebooks in the binding of a psalter he was supposed to be rebinding. He reads it, slowly, not quite sure if it's heretical or just romantic in a way the Abbey never taught. It isn't signed, but it speaks of orchards and riddles, and a girl with a voice like burnt sugar. The boy copies it down and keeps it hidden under his mattress. That spring, he writes his first poem and dedicates it simply, for the one who smelled like peaches. He doesn't know what it means, not fully, but he knows it matters. Elsewhere, in a dusty archive near Toulouse, a scholar compiling lost correspondence stumbles upon a bundle of letters written in a hand so florid it might as well be singing. The tone is gentle, the phrasing hesitant but sharp. One letter describes the night air in such detail it feels like weather leaking from the paper. She reads them all in a sitting, tears streaming not from sadness but from the overwhelming familiarity of something almost remembered. She decides to publish a translation, calling it The Wind Between Words. It sells 17 copies in the first year, 1 to a retired professor, 2 to a couple on their honeymoon, the rest scattered, found, cherished, forgotten, rediscovered exactly how you'd want it, in a small convent garden. The grandniece of a nun tends to the herbs while humming a tune no one taught her. It's something she's always known, an odd little melody she claims came to her in a dream. One of the older nuns hears it and pauses, eyes distant. She remembers a story told to her as a girl about a monk and a merchant's daughter, and a fig tree that bore witness to secrets too lovely to confess. She doesn't speak, just listens. Some songs don't need explanations, and through it all, the fig trees continue to bloom. Not just the original long since reduced to memory and mulch, but others planted by those who never knew you. Not directly, but felt your presence in the shape of a sentence or the fold of a letter. Fig trees beside libraries, behind convent walls, in the courtyards of schools where teachers assign write a letter you'll never send, and quietly hope someone writes it to the orchard ghost. One teacher bored, curious, insomniac, upon your story online one night while looking for historical scandals that aren't too gruesome for teenagers. She finds a post about you, half serious, half sarcastic, titled The Monk Who Wrote Love Letters and Accidentally Bankrupted His Abbey. She reads it twice, then assigns it to her class. Half of them don't care. One student, though the one who always doodles in the margins, writes a short story inspired by it. In her version, the girl rescues the monk using only riddles and a strategically placed cheese wheel. She wins a local award. She thanks a random dead monk who got caught loving too loudly. You'd love her. Your legacy, such as it is, becomes like the orchard you once dreamed of escaping through, messy, fragrant, always a little overgrown. But that's the point. It resists pruning. It survives because it wasn't cultivated for glory, just for feeling, for the brief human relief of being understood. Sometimes someone leaves a note on your grave, nothing grand, just folded paper, tucked gently in the crook of the fig tree. They never sign it. The words are often strange, out of time. He remembered, she waited, still writing, and every once in a while, thank you. No one keeps track of them. No one's supposed to. That's not the kind of story this is. But they keep appearing, and in their small, quiet way, they are louder than any sermon, any hymn, any name carved into stone. So you, wherever you are, nin, ink, in memory, in the slow exhale before. Sleep exists not in grand endings, but in the soft, strange ripple of continued imagination. In every hand that folds a letter and never sends it. In every reader who falls asleep wondering if figs ever bloomed again in that orchard. In every sigh that escapes someone's lips as they close a book and whisper, maybe I should write something like that. There's something quietly subversive about how stories like yours survive not by being shouted from cathedral steps or etched in marble, but by slipping through the cracks, passed hand to hand like contraband hope. And perhaps that's the truest legacy you leave. Not a name, not a title, not even a confirmed birthplace, but a feeling. That fleeting, tender ache of something almost remembered, of love threaded through time like a note you swear you once read but can't quite place. In the centuries after your last letter, your story is told again and again, always a little wrong, always a little right. In one version, you never existed, but your letters were penned by a lonely monk exiled for reasons no one remembers. In another, you married the girl, and together opened a bakery that smuggled poetry between loaves. In yet another, in certain poetic circles, you both turned to the sea, she becoming a sailor, you her navigator, writing love notes in the stars. These aren't true, of course, but they aren't false either, because by now you are a story, and stories, like figs and forgiveness, ripen best in wild places. One summer, in a sun-baked village perched above terraced fields, a traveling musician strums a tune between songs and tells a tale of a monk who fell in love with a voice, not a face, and wrote it letters for 20 years without ever learning her name. His audience, mostly children and goats, clap politely. The goats appear unimpressed. One old woman, though wrinkled and wide-eyed, smiles strangely and murmurs, "He used to hum that in Narbonne." No one knows what she means. Elsewhere, a ceramicist carves your words into bowls. Not all your words, just the ones that feel like prayers but end like jokes. Forgive me for the orchard, but not the apple. She stole my glove, then my spine. I lit a candle. She lit the manuscript. The bowls don't sell well, but that doesn't stop her. She says she's making them for the people who haven't arrived yet. You'd understand. There's a strange comfort in watching your story drift, shapeshift, settle like dust in places you never imagined. In Marseille, a group of students start a zine titled Peach-Stained Fingers. It's full of poorly edited poems and anonymous confessions. Their logo is a stylized fig tree with initials carved into the trunk, never the same initials twice. In northern England, a librarian catalogues an anonymous collection of love notes filed under monastic suspicion, miscellaneous. She reads one aloud during a storm and swears the lights flicker in time with the rhythm. Historians remain baffled. The more they try to draw clean lines around your life, the blurrier it gets. The dates don't line up, the handwriting changes, the stories contradict. One insists you died of heartbreak. Another claims you retired and taught geese to recite psalms. A few give up and simply file you under emotional anomalies, pre-Renaissance. And in a way, they're right. You are an anomaly. Not because of what you wrote, but because it lasted. Because it meant something to someone. Because it still does. Your orchard, long gone in the physical sense, has become a kind of metaphorical refuge. People speak of it the way they speak of dreams they're sure weren't theirs. I once kissed someone beneath a fig tree. I dreamed of folded letters tied in ribbon. I knew a monk who wrote like he was falling, even when standing. Still, no one can prove it. No one needs to. Belief, in this case, is the point. She, whoever she was, however she lived afterwards, remains the quieter half of the legend. But that suits her. She was never the type to chase recognition. Her legacy blooms in margins, in how readers linger over your letters, wondering about the girl who inspired such reckless tenderness, in how writers imagine her voice, her scent, her clever quips about apples, in how young lovers adopt her coded phrases without realizing they're quoting history. She doesn't need a plaque. She never did. Her monument is the hesitation before a kiss, the folded paper slipped into a sleeve, the pause between hello and what took you so long. One particularly persistent, academically working through unresolved emotions, publishes a paper attempting to decode every metaphor in your letters. He charts orchard as temptation, fig as feminine power, and ink-stained glove as submission. He misses the joke you once made about goat cheese and longing. You'd be amused, probably grateful that your most personal phrases are still confusing people after so long. That, perhaps, was the secret. You never wrote to be understood by everyone, only by one. And in doing so, you reached thousands. And so the story lingers, not in archives or dissertations or footnotes, though it appears in all of those. It lingers in candlelit readings, in the corner shelves of independent bookstores, in whispered retellings over tea, in the long walks someone takes while thinking about a letter they never sent, in the way a line from one of your poems suddenly makes someone pause and feel something soft break open inside them. That's where you live now, not as Etienne the monk, not even as a man, but as a moment, a mood, a reminder. You, who once feared being caught, are now remembered in the gentlest act of rebellion, the choice to love, fully and foolishly, in a world that demanded silence. You didn't defy the Abbey with swords or speeches. You did it with ink, with metaphors so messy they had to be real, with stories tucked into the folds of life, too fragile to shout, too precious not to whisper. And perhaps the real reason your story endures is this: you never wrote to be famous. You wrote to be heard. And somewhere, someone is still listening. The orchard was always metaphor, even when it wasn't. You understood that long before scholars did, before they lined their annotated volumes with footnotes speculating on your garden imagery, as if the apples weren't real, or worse, too real to matter. But you knew it was never about fruit, or fences, or fig leaves. It was about breath, the way it caught in your chest when she leaned in too close. About silence, not the holy kind, but the kind thick with unsaid things. And about the space between rule and risk, where love happened not in defiance, but in spite of caution. You didn't set out to write a myth. You just couldn't help writing her. That's the part people never quite get. They think your letters were rebellion, cleverness, the act of a monk too smart for vows and too bored for virtue. But the truth is simpler. You wrote because not writing was worse, because her absence filled the spaces between psalms and your hands, meant for copying divine law, couldn't stop shaking until they wrote something human. Of course, the human thing is what got you caught, and then forgiven, and then, slowly, forgotten. But not by everyone. In a mountain convent far from Saint-Giraud, a nun with a limp and a ferocious sense of privacy begins collecting lost love letters. Some real, some forged, all deeply felt. She never names the project, never files it properly, just slips each one into a box beneath her bed. The older she gets, the more she believes none of them were truly written for the people they were addressed to. Love, she tells a novice once, is a performance we put on in the mirror. She has no idea that one of the first letters in the box is yours. She found it pressed inside a forgotten hymnal, misused as a bookmark, stained by candle wax. And time, she reads it aloud once a year, never the same day twice. Elsewhere, a translator obsessed with medieval affection, not war, not plague, not kings, decides to compile a volume of anonymous monastic verse. His editor hates the idea. He does it anyway. In a footnote on page 93, he references you, not by name, just as the orchard scribe. He speculates wildly about the identity of your beloved, suggesting she may have been a noblewoman, or perhaps a fellow monk in disguise, or, more romantically, a figment of your own longing. But the translation, it's perfect. Even the margin. Joke about goats and metaphysics lands. In your lifetime, the Abbey tried to erase you gently. No excommunication, no inquisition, just a quiet redirection of your name into smaller roles. A line here, a note there. The same way you used to annotate texts politely, but with intent. And yet, every time someone tried to simplify your story, someone else kept it alive. A nun who shared your poems under her breath at sewing circles. A librarian who filed your mischief under spiritual curiosities. A merchant's son who swore his mother once danced with you in a field full of bees. They kept it going not because it was dramatic, but because it was possible. And what a dangerous thing possibility is, especially in history. You didn't storm castles or burn churches. You wrote a letter, that's all. A small, folded, sweet-scented letter that said, in no uncertain terms, I am thinking of you more than I should. And that opened a door, not just for her, not just for you, but for everyone who came after. That's the part the academics don't understand when they argue about who you were. They measure impact in revolts, reforms, revolutions, but you weren't a hammer. You were a draft, a breeze, a page left open on a table someone wasn't supposed to read. The kind of thing that lingers in the mind long after the facts have faded. One archivist, overwhelmed and overtired, finds one of your pages in the bottom of a box mislabeled grain taxes. It's not even a complete letter, just the middle. A sentence that reads, I would rather be reprimanded for dreaming than praised for obedience. She stops scanning, reads it again. Then again, later that night, she writes it in her journal. Then on a post-it. Then on the wall above her bed. Eventually, she has it tattooed behind her ear, when no one else sees it. But she knows it's there. And so do you. You exist now in unexpected places. Not just in archives or digital files or scholarly citations, but in gestures. A teenager slipping a note into a crush's locker with no return name. A retiree who sends anonymous postcards full of compliments to strangers. A couple who renew their vows by reading each other's first emails, complete with typos and awkward metaphors. They don't know you, but they echo you. And sometimes, only sometimes, someone does know, or suspects, or half remembers. A professor who taught your story in an elective once. A poet who referenced you in a book no one read but her. A student who chose to do a project on you instead of St. Francis, because you seemed more fun. They don't always remember the name Etienne, but they remember the orchard, the glove, the ink stain shaped like a heart that wasn't, but almost was. The Abbey never rebuilt the orchard. They planted cabbages instead. Practicable, profitable, but each spring, one tree knot, a fig, not an apple, just some stubborn offshoot that refuses. Pruning blooms early. Too early, the monks say. Inconveniently early. They trim it back. It grows again. No one talks about it, but the novices pass it on in whispers. That's the orchard tree. You can wish there, but don't tell anyone. And someone always does. Not every legacy carves its initials into stone. Some scratch theirs lightly in bark, or press them into soft parchment, or fold them into letters never sent, but always read. Yours is one of those dots, and the world, still unsure how to hold that kind of love, holds it anyway, carefully, tenderly, like a letter tied with green ribbon, addressed only to whoever remembers the orchard. The final escape plan was never supposed to work. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a metaphor, a joke between two people who loved metaphors a little too much. When she first sketched it out late one night on the back of a stolen sermon scroll sheet, laughed and said, "We'll need a rope, a soup ladle, and at least 2 reasonably intelligent songbirds." You were supposed to laugh too, and you did, eventually. But you also kept the scroll, folded it neatly, hid it inside a psalter where no one would look unless they were searching for forgiveness, and found curiosity instead. She had written the plan out in ridiculous detail. Step 1. Distract the abbot with theological questions about whether angels could be convinced to officiate secret marriages. Step 2. Create a decoy ETN using hay, a spare robe, and Giddam, the horse's old saddle. Step 3. Climb the south wall using the rope tied to the soup ladle wedged in the drainage grate. Step 4. Let the songbirds loose as a signal. Step 5. Run. It was absurd, completely unworkable, but you reread it more times than you'll ever admit. And in those late hours, when the abbey walls seemed to shrink with every breath, the plan started to feel possible, not because it was, but because it dared to exist, because she had taken all the limitations of your world vows. Stone walls, fig trees that couldn't tell secrets, sand drawn a door in the middle of them. A door only you two could see. You never used the plan, not in that form. But you used the idea of it. You carried it in your bones like a hymn you didn't believe in, but still found comfort singing. And now, all these years later, long after the soup ladle rusted and the songbirds turned into metaphor, you find yourself telling it again, not as a joke, not even as a story, but as a kind of prayer. The children in the village love it, though. You have to water it down for them. You skip the parts about the wine cellar and the orchard rendezvous. Instead, you focus on the soup ladle, which becomes a legendary artifact in their imaginations. One day, one of them even brings you a handmade version, clay, slightly lopsided, painted with flowers. You keep it on your writing desk. A reminder she would have liked that. Not the soup ladle necessarily, but the fact that the planther, impossibly silly, delightfully romantic planner lived the scandal, the punishment, the abbey itself, that it became its own kind of myth, and in some versions of the story, told now in whispers and workshop scripts, the plan does work. You vanish, she waits, a cart arrives, a tree blooms, a horse trots off, only slightly confused, and both of you leave behind letters like breadcrumbs, letting the world puzzle out what happened after. That's what you begin to notice in your later years, how the story keeps fracturing and regenerating. In one village, someone swears you faked your death and opened a vineyard. In another, they claim you became a pirate who only plundered libraries. A traveling theatre troupe performs a version of your tale where every character is a different herb she's time. You're rosemary. The abbot is definitely coriander. It makes no sense. You love it, and through it all, you continue to write, not because there's anything left to prove, but because it's how you breathe. The fig tree outside your window is crooked, full of bees and secrets. Sometimes you sit beneath it and write lines you never finish. Not because you've lost the words, but because you like the way they hang, suspended, like ripe fruit that might fall or might not. You imagine her sometimes, older, wiser, still smirking at the world's absurdity. You wonder if she ever tells anyone the truth, or if she, too, has fractured into versions. In one, she became a midwife who whispered poetry during difficult births. In another, She ran a tavern for pilgrims where the soup was always a little too seasoned, but the bread was shaped like hearts. In Your Favorite, she became a traveling playwright, slipping coded lines about orchards into comedies about saints and sinners. You'll never know which, if any, is true. But that's the beauty of it. The story didn't end when you stayed, or when she left. It ended every time someone told it again, with a new twist, a new punchline, a new mistake that felt almost like a miracle. And that's what this plan, this absurd, sweet, impossible escape plan really was. A blueprint for the a way to say, we could have, even if you didn't. A way to live, even when you stayed put. A way to love, even when you weren't supposed to. Because love, at its most dangerous and most divine, isn't about fleeing. It's about imagining. That flight is always an option, even when you choose to walk instead. So now, when the children ask about the rope and the ladle and the songbirds, you smile and say, it didn't work, but it almost did. And when they ask, what happened next, you tell them this. She wrote me a final letter, just 3 lines. It said, I couldn't climb the wall, so I dug underneath. Meet me halfway, and I did. The verdict echoed through the abbey, not like thunder, but like the soft click of a lock sliding into place. Final quiet, and just loud enough to make your stomach turn. There was no dramatic announcement, no gathering of weeping monks or flaming torches, just Father Bernard standing at the front of the chapter house with his hands folded too tightly, and his mouth forming the kind of sentence that tasted like dust. Brother Etienne will remain in the abbey, he said, but not in his previous station. It has been decided. The words were chosen carefully, as if someone had taken the Latin equivalent of exile and wrapped it in the politest euphemism. Possible, you weren't being cast out. No, no. That would suggest passion, drama, things the Abbey worked hard to avoid. Instead, you were being reassigned to the margins, to the places between important tasks, between recorded lines, between daily prayers and remembered names. Your new assignment was, as they called it, horticultural and ossuary upkeep. Translation, you'd be tending the gardens no one used, and the bones no one visited. Your inkwell was confiscated, your manuscripts redistributed, your name removed from the rota in the scriptorium. A small change, perhaps, to anyone else. But to you, it was the final snuffing out of the only light you dared to claim for yourself. The light of your words, the warmth of your letters, the idea that your hands were meant for more than weeding and washing the dead dot the next morning. You were handed a dull spade, a scratchy wool cowl that smelled like regret and mildew, and a list of graves that needed tending. Most were unmarked. Some weren't even real, just lumps of soil and old abbey rumour. You began digging, not deep, just enough to clear debris, to prove you were doing what was asked. You said nothing. You smiled at no one, but inside, something sour began to curdle. Not rage, not despair, something simpler. Resignation, the kind that burns slow. She didn't write again, or if she did, the letters never made it past the gate. Guillaume, your once heroic steed of nearly legendary lethargy, was sold to a bakery. For delivery runs. The orchard remained, but it was declared off-limits for aesthetic restructuring. The monks stopped making eye contact. Even Brother Louis, once your tentative ally, now winced when your name was spoken. You became the shadow in the corner, the lesson without a sermon. The whisper, don't be like him, but still you didn't. Leave. That was the part that confused everyone. They expected defiance. or disappearance. They expected you to sneak out through the herb cellar at midnight or stage one final monastic coup, quoting Song of Songs while pelting the abbot with dried apples. But you didn't. You stayed. You dug. You planted. You watered the herbs you once used as metaphors and now used to soothe the old brother's aching knees. You cleaned the bones, catalogued them, whispered apologies to the ones you disturbed. You became something else, not broken, not quite whole, but reshaped. And then, slowly, something stranger happened. The monks began talking to you again, not all at once, not warmly, but practically. Brother Thomas needed lavender for his headaches. Brother Hugo asked if you'd seen the missing spade. Even Father Bernard, one rainy morning, nodded at your compost pile and muttered, "Efficient." It wasn't redemption, but it was acknowledgement. You started humming again, softly, nothing recognizable. Just the rhythm of your hands working the soil, the music of someone still thinking in verses, even when none were being written down. The abbey dogs began sleeping, near your tools. A bird built its nest in the crook of the ossuary door. The world, without ceremony, began to accept you as part of the background. And from the background, you began to see everything. The monks weren't cruel, not really, just tired, bound by rules they'd memorized but never fully understood. They envied your scandal, though they'd never admit it. Not the girl, not the letters, but the idea that for a brief moment you had believed something enough to risk comfort, to risk community, to risk being carved out of the stone wall you had once belonged to. Historians, centuries later, would look at the records of your trial and say, "Ah, here is where the story ends." But it didn't. It shifted, because your punishment wasn't silence. It was seen clearly. And once you saw the abbey not as sacred but as structure, not as divine but as system, everything changed, not bitterly, not rebelliously, just ... patiently. You began to write again, not in ink, not yet, but in symbols. You arranged the herb beds into verses, a ring of time for longing, a spiral of rosemary for memory. You planted marjoram near the north wall and hoped someone would notice the shape it formed, a heart, lopsided, earnest, ridiculous. She would have teased you. You smiled at the thought. The bones too became your canvas. Not in a morbid way. You cleaned them gently, whispered their names when you knew them. When you didn't, you gave them new ones. Names from your letters, names from her poems, names that had no saints but might have in another world. You spoke less, listened more, learned that even those who condemned you had cracks in their faith. You heard Father Bernard weep once, alone, in the chapel, after forgetting the words to his own sermon. You saw Brother Henry, long gone by then, mentioned only in mutters, listed in a prayer book under-transferred for cause. You read between the lines, and then, one late summer afternoon, as the orchard bloomed again in defiance of pruning, you found a note, not a letter, just a line, tucked beneath a rock near the rosemary. It read, still writing, no signature, no scent, just ink, familiar, firm, impossible. You didn't respond, not directly, but that night you left a sprig of thyme on the wall, and the next morning it was gone. The abbey's finances didn't collapse overnight. That would have been poetic. Instead, they unraveled the way most things in monasteries do gradually. Then all at once, with a strong whiff of honey gone rancid and a growing stack of increasingly tense letters from merchant guilds. At first, it was just whispers. a missed shipment of saffron, a tithe that arrived in boiled linen instead of coin, a wagon of wax candles that mysteriously turned up half-melted and already burned down to nubs. The brothers muttered about poor harvests, about miscounted inventories, about divine testing. But you knew better. Everyone did. Her father had always been careful, loud in public, but strategic in silence. He wasn't a noble, no, but he had influence, the kind of influence that came in crates of dried figs and jars of perfumed oil and donations with conditions no one dared write down. The kind that built libraries, then burned letters. The kind that didn't make threats, just ... stopped sending things. And that was worse. It started small. The honey stopped arriving. The same honey that Father Bernard once claimed helped him hear God more clearly during matins. No explanation. Just gone. Then the olive oiler, specific vintage they used for anointing and for bread, which some said had healing properties, though most suspected it was just really good oil. After that, the parchment. Suddenly, half the scriptorium was copying sacred texts on reused fish invoices. It would have been funny if it weren't so humiliating. Blessed are the delivery pending. You weren't in the scriptorium anymore, of course. You were in the gardens. But you heard everything. The grumbles, the revised menus, the morning prayers where monks prayed for restoration of fruitful partnerships, which was Abbey for please, send back the raisins. Brother Louis confessed to you one day, while helping dig up a patch of lavender that had never quite taken root. We used to be important, you know, before you and your orchard letters, before ... all of it. You didn't respond. Not with words. Just handed him a clump of marjoram and asked him to plant it straight this time. He didn't, but he tried. The real panic didn't start until the tithe record went missing. A single sheet of vellum covered in tiny ink-smudged numbers detailing which family owed what. It had been copied 3 times, locked in a chest, and only opened once a year. And now it was gone, vanished, stolen, perhaps, or misfiled in the box labeled Festive Psalms, not for Lent. Either way, it was the last thin thread holding the Abbey's accounts together. Without it, no one knew what had been paid, what had been forgiven, or who had quietly stopped pretending to care. Father Bernard tried to remain calm. He delivered sermons on detachment, on the holiness of scarcity, on the virtue of leaner living. But even he couldn't hide the sweat pooling beneath his scapula, or the fact that he had started diluting the communion wine just a little more than usual. Some monks whispered that God was testing them. Others whispered that she was. You still didn't know whether she had orchestrated this gentle economic siege. But it felt like her. The precision, the patience, the refusal to storm the gates, opting instead to slowly starve the structure that had tried to erase you. She didn't destroy it. She let it decay in silence. And in some strange, bitter corner of your heart, you respected that. Maybe even loved her more for it. Then came the letters, not from her, from merchants, from bishops, from curious nobles who wanted to know why their usual deliveries of perfumed scrolls and marinated walnuts had been delayed. The abbot's desk began to sag under the weight of correspondence, most of it accusatory, some of it vaguely threatening, and one delivered by hand, sealed with green wax, simply read, "We remember what you did." No signature, just that it might not have been from her, but you knew it was for you. The Abbey began making changes, silent ones. Brother Henry, already reassigned, had his name quietly removed from the donation register. His more inflammatory sermons on discipline were pulled from circulation. Father Bernard stopped referencing certain sins during Mass. The orchard, once declared off limits, was reopened, though only during daylight and only for supervised walks. You were invited back into the scriptorium, politely, without apology. You declined, politely instead. You expanded the herb beds, added new rows, taught novices how to cut rosemary without bruising it. You labeled everything in verse. The marjoram bore a sign that read, "For forgetfulness and secret remembering." The mint, to cool the breath of liars and lovers. No one questioned you. Not anymore. The abbey limped on, not ruined, not redeemed, just ... quieter, a little less certain, a little more careful. And in that space, you found something like peace, not absolution, but usefulness. You were still there, and that, in itself, was a kind of quiet triumph. Sometimes you still looked for her handwriting, in market receipts, in donation lists, in the margins of borrowed books. You never found it, but every once in a while a note would appear. No wax, no scent, just a single sentence, folded and tucked where only you would find it. Did you watered the thyme, or the apples looked smug today? Once you hum when you dig. I always liked that. You never saw who left them. You didn't need to. And one late autumn morning, as the orchard leaves turned the color of old parchment, you found a basket on your workbench. Inside, a jar of honey, a green scarf, and a ladle carved with vines. No note, just that. You sat beside the fig tree for hours that day, didn't write, didn't dig, just held the scarf, the ladle, and every memory they carried. You laughed once, loud enough to scare a squirrel off the wall, and then you whispered, "I'll meet you halfway." When the king's men arrived, they didn't come with trumpets or banners, no armored parade or clattering cavalry. Just 3 men in good boots and dusted cloaks, with the weary eyes of professional eavesdroppers and an air of having already heard too much. They bore a royal seal and a letter that was equal parts curiosity and veiled reprimand. His Majesty had heard something peculiar, whispers of an abbey unraveling not from fire or famine, but from fig trees, poetry, and an especially memorable series of love letters. The court had laughed. Then, inevitably, the king had stopped laughing. Now, he wanted answers. They didn't say they were there because of you, but you knew, everyone did. The way Father Bernard trembled slightly as he opened the gate. The way Brother Louis accidentally dropped the communion wine as he tripped over his own guilt. The way the novices stood, a little too still, as if trying to blend into the stone. Your name was never spoken, but it curled beneath every syllable. A shadow in the margins of every conversation. The royal inspectors, technically scribes, though their expressions were more suited to interrogation than illumination, walked the grounds with a kind of grim politeness. They inspected the scriptorium, flipped through half-finished psalms, frowned at the annotations in the margins. One even paused at the page with your old poetic flourish of a vine entwining the word blessed and muttered flamboyant. Another raised an eyebrow at the herb garden signs, reading aloud the marjoram tag, "For forgetfulness and secret remembering." He looked at you then. You smiled. He didn't. They asked questions, softly, with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Why had the donations from the merchant families stopped? Why were there rumors of misconduct in the novice quarters? Why had the abbey lost its olive oil supplier, its saffron allotment, its lucrative parchment contract? Why was there an orchard with no financial records of yield, only verses etched into stones, and what appeared to be an unusually loyal goat? Father Bernard tried. Truly, he did. He cited weather, market fluctuations, pestilence, moral reform at one point, which made one inspector snort softly. He avoided your name like it was a loose stone in a path. But the inspectors had their own parchments. They asked about a girl, about a scarf, about letters that were said to smell of peaches and read like temptation. They asked why one of the abbey's exiled scribes was now being quoted in secular love poetry compilations, under the pseudonym The Orchard Quill. They asked why a nun in Narbonne had reportedly confessed that her friend once loved a monk so thoroughly she taught a fig tree to carry messages. It was chaos, but refined shame delivered with grammar. You, for your part, were not summoned. Not officially, but they did find you, standing in the garden, humming. The lead inspector approached with a look of cautious disdain and asked, "Do you still write?" You said, "Only when the herbs ask nicely." He didn't respond, just made a note. "Is it true you once received a letter hidden in a basket of apples?" "Yes," you said. "There were also plums, terrible ones." Another note. They didn't arrest anyone. They weren't there for punishment. They were there for precedent, for story, for the kind of detail that would make a quiet scandal seem less threatening to the institution and more like an amusing footnote in a kingdom that preferred its poets dead, or at least repentant. They left after 3 days, their parchments full, their expressions unreadable. But before they did, one of them, perhaps the youngest, asked you, in a voice just above a whisper, did she ever write back? And you said, she never stopped. After they left, the abbey exhaled like a bellows too long pressed. Father Bernard resigned a month later, citing health, though everyone suspected the real cause was a single green scarf that someone had tacked onto his study door with a ladle-shaped pin. The new abbot was younger, less concerned with image, more inclined to let the orchard remain wild. He promoted Brother Louis to library assistant and quietly reinstated your ink privileges, though he did request, just as a gesture, that your next poem not involve theological puns and goats. The abbey's reputation never fully recovered, but it didn't collapse either. It settled, became a place of rumor and pilgrimage. Students from other monasteries began arriving with questions about the orchard. Scribes asked if they could copy the herb poems. One noblewoman, traveling incognito, asked to see the ladle. You showed her, she cried. You offered her time, tea. She said it tasted like old promises. You said that was the point. The orchard grew wilder every year. The fig tree bent closer to the wall, as if listening. The herbs spread in patterns you no longer tried to control. Children, on rare feast days, were allowed to walk the paths barefoot. One left a letter at the base of the tree, addressed simply to anyone who loved too early. You didn't touch it, you just read it once, then buried it beneath the mint, and one spring morning, as the first blossom cracked open and the bees began their whispered debates, you found a package on your bench, wrapped in green cloth, tied with a ribbon. No note, no label. Inside, a new inkwell carved from stone, shaped like a heart. On the bottom, etched in tiny script, still, writing, still ridiculous, you wept for the first time in years. In the end, the abbey became a story, not a relic, not a ruin, a story. People came not to pray, not exactly, but to listen, to ask where the letters were buried, to touch the fig tree and hope it remembered them. They came for the orchard, yes, but also for you, for the whisper of your name in verses carved into herb beds, for the way the wind seemed to hum when it passed over the stones you once planted like punctuation across the garden paths, for the quiet scandal that had aged into legend, like wine left in a cellar too long but still warm when poured. You stayed, even as others left, even as the ink on your own hands began to fade. You stayed because something about the place had changed, perhaps because you had changed. No longer a novice dreaming of escape, no longer the center of whispered judgment or careful pity, just a man, a keeper of gardens, a cleaner of bones, a witness to memory. The letters you had once hidden were no longer secrets. They had been found, yes, scattered, reassembled, debated, but more importantly, they had been heard. That mattered more. Some were copied and stored in libraries. Others were rephrased in song. One had been stitched into the lining of a child's traveling coat by a mother who believed love might ward off storms. You never asked how people got them. You knew she had sent them, piece by piece, not for glory, not for closure, just because one morning you awoke to find the orchard covered in small, folded papers, dozens, white against the green, notes left by visitors, by locals, by monks who had once scoffed at poetry and now quoted you between prayers. You didn't read all of them, but you did collect them, tucked them into a weathered satchel once used to carry apples and plans and ink that had nearly gotten you exiled. You kept that satchel beneath your cot, labeled it unfinished business, your final. Days were unremarkable. No deathbed confessions, no last-minute miracles. You still hummed. You still wandered the orchard at dawn, still wrote lines you never intended to share, then shared them anyway, still listened for the sound of paper brushing against fig leaves. One evening, a novice named Jean asked if it was true you once turned down a bishopric. You said, "I turned down a sermon." He didn't understand, but he laughed anyway. That night, he left a letter by the rosemary. It read, "Teach me how to write like I've been forgiven." You left him a poem in return. Start with dirt, add longing, water rarely, expect nothing, hope anyway. Then, one cool twilight, birds gone quiet, bells long past ringing, you sat in your favorite spot beneath the fig tree. The same robe, the same scarf, your hands folded over a blank page. You closed your eyes, just for a moment, just long enough. They found you the next morning, peaceful, smiling, the page still empty, because maybe, finally, there was nothing left to write. Or maybe you knew someone else would pick up the pen, and they did. So now, dear listener, we let the story soften. Let the candle dim. Let the orchard fade into the distance, where fig trees lean into each other like conspirators and old monks. Hum lullabies for apples. Let your breath settle into the rhythm of the garden paths, winding not toward endings, but toward rest. Because somewhere, a novice is still scribbling in the margins. Somewhere, someone is folding a letter they'll never send. Somewhere, a goat with excellent taste is sniffing a scroll left behind on a bench carved with initials no one recognizes anymore. Somewhere, a scarf is knotted gently around someone's wrist, not for fashion, not for warmth, but for remembrance. You're there too now, in that place, that orchard of almosts, that abbey of afters. You've walked the gravel, heard the verses, smelled the thyme, you've read the letters. You've wondered if you would have dared to write your own. And maybe you will, but not tonight. Tonight, just rest. Let your limbs go quiet. Let your thoughts slow to the pace of soft ink drying on handmade paper. Let your heartbeat echo gently, with the sound of pages turning in another room, long ago, lit by candlelight and hope. You're safe here, the scandal's over. The love remains, sleep well, poet, end of script. Sweet dreams,